Okay, so for the second video, I wanted to touch on egalitarianism, a little bit of fair speech, some of my thoughts on that, and how egalitarians tend to approach some society challenges and kind of what they think about that and how they feel about going about making those changes to incorporate certain cultures in our society, affirmative action, and so on. So, one of the main counter arguments for egalitarians is that um, a lot of people are against like, oh, well, we don't need more welfare. If we have more welfare, it means more taxes, and then it benefits the people who are quote unquote lazy. And there's people like us who are hardworking, and now I'm my brother's keeper, and I'm paying for these people. And egalitarians would say that wealthy people actually benefit from these welfare programs as well, and it's actually to better your self interest, and you're able to partake in some of these things as well. And they don't just benefit poor people, they also benefit the wealthy people as well. And that they have that fair and equal access to utilize these. They're not being penalized. It's not to say that these programs can't be utilized. There are some programs like, economic based programs and things like that, for welfare and certain parts of unemployment, Section 8 housing, that obviously wealthy people cannot be a part of, because that is specifically to fund those less fortunate and give them opportunities. But for the general sake of this argument, they would say you also have the opportunity to partake in these public resources that we're making available for everybody, not just poor people. So that meaningful access to private property is really the big key argument here. And they actually argue that poverty is the utmost form of interference from the government, that it does not equal true, equal, and fair democracy. That's not what democracy is all about. So for equality to be meaningful, the government would need to provide certain access to property for those who wouldn't normally be able to access it normally on their own, whether that's due to physical limitations or fiscal limitations. The idea, especially for like parks and libraries, no matter who you are, you should have equal access, rich, poor, black, white, Middle Eastern, doesn't matter. Everybody should have fair and equal access to these welfare programs. And that is the most truest form of democracy and non interference. So, a lot of egalitarians would argue, and of course, there's some exceptions always, but generally, this idea that poverty is actually the greatest form of interference, that you can't truly enjoy true freedom and a good way of life if we have these huge gaps between the rich and the poor, right? They actually say that this taxation or these welfare programs will ultimately benefit the vast majority and society in general. And the whole idea that society as a whole will be thriving. Everybody in that society will be thriving if they are given these things like providing access to education, technology, and other different resources for the arts, for language, things like that, are actually going to benefit society the most, as opposed to just having rich people at the top and poor people at the bottom. One thing that I really wanted to touch on was the jobs. And I found this really, really interesting to me and very applicable to my own life. As you know, my husband works in real estate. And so we are self employed. We do run our own business. We have a company. And obviously, we do work out of the state of California. So we are very heavily taxed here. I actually pay 3 sets of taxes. I know a lot of people in Chicago also who work in the city of Chicago have to pay that third tax as well. But for this sake, we're just going off of that premise. So, according to the jobs, I found this very, very, very interesting. When we look at a capitalist society and what jobs are favored above other jobs, obviously capitalism is going to value those capitalist principles, which means it's going to value those capitalist jobs. And what are the capitalist jobs? The capitalist jobs benefit the environment, they stimulate wealth, they stimulate growth. It's that idea that jobs are morally arbitrary, but capitalism overall is going to benefit, or I'm sorry, is going to promote the jobs the most where capitalism can actually benefit the most, right? So money talks. And it's this idea like hard work is not always rewarded. And I've told you before, I work at a restaurant, and we always used to say like the dishwasher is the heart and soul of the restaurant. It's the heartbeat of the restaurant. It's by far the most underappreciated job, but it's the one job that we cannot run this restaurant without. Technically, I could run it without a bartender. A manager could go back there. We could run it without a server. A host could come help out, or a line cook could come out and take tables. They may not know how, but they physically could do that. Whereas the dishwasher, if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have dishes to get the food out, to get to the guests, to take the orders, to bring in the food. Like, it's just like this ongoing thing. And so we always stress that the dishwasher, even though it's the most undervalued position, should be seen as the most valuable and important position in the restaurant. And so that it really made me think of that. And unfortunately, in our society, me as a server, like technically you could do without my job, but for some reason it is seen as the most valuable job in the restaurant. And I got paid the most. The dishwasher in the back was getting paid minimum wage. They were usually Hispanic or minority of some, to some degree. And most of the people who were out on the floor were valued the most, and we were paid the most, even though my job wasn't necessarily the most important. Anybody could go do my job. Technically, anybody could be a dishwasher as well, but if you eliminate that position from the restaurant, you'd be screwed, right? So that was kind of like an idea that really like popped up in my head, that I feel like that's kind of how our society works in a way as well. And just because you're the most hardworking, like you said, those farmers, if they didn't farm for us, I wouldn't have food to put on my table. I would die. But that's a very undervalued position. And I feel that more manual labor, even though it's very necessary and very much so needed in society, capitalism tends to say the people on Wall Street, the corporate real estate in general, if you can stimulate the economy, build wealth, which means the government can actually take more from you if you make more, right? So to speak. There's of course some loopholes around that, like those big executives that get around those taxes. But essentially, if you make more, the economy is actually going to stimulate more. So egalitarians say just because you work harder doesn't mean that you're always going to be rewarded and compensated as such. And so because our society does that, it's actually hindering the good life. It's hindering equality, and it's hindering that true freedom and democracy, that we all have equal access to live a good and prosperous life. So, just dabbling in a couple social issues, affirmative action. I like that you said it actually doesn't really impact private property as much as you think. A lot of those isms, sexism, racism, a lot of those things aren't intentional. I'd say actually more often than not, I would argue they're not intentional, and they're not something that's a conscious thought. They're blatantly, sometimes people are because they're just jerks, but affirmative action kind of steps in as a way to protect and eliminate some of those possibilities for discrimination to exist in the workplace. I have a lot more to say about that, but I want to hop on to some of the cultural differences that they emphasize on as well. So, some cultural differences making up for the forced loss of their culture. I loved that, because that's something I'm really big on. Obviously, I live in California here, and we value, which is actually in a lot of other parts of the country. I'm obviously from the Midwest. I told you I'm from Michigan. And there are African Americans out there, of course. There are Latinos. There are different Asian descents out there as well. But it's not really something that's celebrated and encouraged and promoted really in any way, especially not when it comes to education or anything like that. It is very much we're white. This is how we do things here. We're in the Midwest, and you're going to live like you're in the Midwest. You're going to live like a white, middle class American in this society. And so there isn't really a big promotion or hype around wanting to be able to include those cultural differences. So one thing that I actually really like about the idea of egalitarianism is that you're able to kind of make up that for that discrimination, whether it's intentional or not, you're able to kind of make up for that the same way that you make up for it in affirmative action. And that we should actually value and even promote those differences by accommodating, the native language. And I know that's a really big thing in the Southwest because they have a huge Native American population. And out here in LA, there's a huge Hispanic population. So I feel in those areas where, and I actually wrote this in my notes, where I feel I think it should be an issue of concern or at least a topic of discussion across our whole country. However, I do feel that less diverse areas, to apply those tax paying dollars, they may not feel that that's really the right decision, or it's something that is that necessary, because there's such a small percentage. In some cases in Michigan, there's only a handful of students who are in that minority group where they would need those language accommodations. So I love the idea that we should all be more culturally sensitive and aware, like the egalitarians would say. However, there was kind of a counter argument that I had with that, is that I feel those efforts, especially if there's tax-paying dollars involved, should really be heavily focused in areas that have that concern, just to be honest, that have that reality in their school. um, because I feel that those programs and those taxpayer dollars would be better utilized in areas that actually have a huge minority population. So it was just one kind of thought that I had, but I really appreciate the concept of that. The last thing I wanted to touch on with egalitarians was the idea of fair speech. And the first thing I thought of was Roseanne. And that obviously happened. I think it was in 2020. It may have been 2019 because I don't remember a lot of 2020. I feel like everything's just like been smushed together for the past year and a half. So, but this idea of fair speech, that speech is not fair, right? And it's often mediated, like you said, by those economics, by money. Money talks. The people who usually have the platform and the means to communicate about what's going on in our world and our society typically tend to be the people who have access to it, which are the people who have more money to be able to access it, right? And so egalitarians, like you said, tend to, there's really not a way that you can enforce it, right? So the idea would be to create a culture and a society where there's pressure, like you said, that cultural society pressure to be more politically correct, to be more aware, to make more active decisions about how we talk about things and how we talk to people and about people, right? So to wrap up, I wanted to talk a little bit about Roseanne. And I think that this is a really great example of those pressures that egalitarians would say we need to be more politically correct. And they went as far as, with Roseanne, she had made those racial slurs and those insensitive comments, I think is like how her publicist kind of put it out there. But essentially she made some really racist, ignorant comments, and they removed her from the show. They killed her off of her own show, so she never had an opportunity to go back. And they pretty much blacklisted her in the industry. And not to say that they were trying to make an example out of her, but in a way they kind of were. And so I think for a lot of Democrats and other egalitarians, it's not to say if you do this we will punish you, but it's a way to say, we can create a culture that doesn't approve of that dialogue, that isn't okay with those insensitive, ignorant comments, and we are going to, as a society, cumulatively, that was my biggest key takeaway, was cumulatively we're going to make an active effort to put a little bit more pressure to not sway people necessarily, but to guide them in a more inclusive direction. I see that a lot in LA. I see it a lot on the West Coast in general, which I think is wonderful. And I think things are starting to move into the Midwest and in the South. I think it's kind of making its way across the country. And a lot of people are obviously fighting back again from last week. That way of life is being threatened. But overall, I always claim to be a little bit more of a moderate. Obviously, I think there's some good on both sides, but overall, I think egalitarians do take a more humanitarian approach to things. However, my husband and I talked a little bit about this after I watched the lectures, and we both agree that just people are selfish in general. So egalitarians are also selfish in their way of thinking, yes, I would love to help other people, but also how is this going to help me? So it's a little bit of both sides. So um, for the last video that I wanted to share with you, I'm going to talk about communism and Marxism. It was just too much to put all in one video. And I also wanted to touch on our little video about communism in the Black community because I also had a couple thoughts on that. So I'll see you in the next video.